Yeah. Having no scan, and she was one of his students as well. She wants to say hi. We did masters together, and Arjan was our first PhD. So that's like, it's a long time they have. Yeah, that's nice. Cool. Oh no, it's okay. We'll see each other after.
Teaching European studies and history of studies to chairs.
Yes.
Just give it a few minutes before they all get in. Starts and then just give it a few minutes.
We already have 20 people online. I'm going to find out.
20-ish, was it? 21?
Okay.
That's about the number of people.
Are they already?
Okay, go.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this event, both here in the room as well as online. My name is Kristijan Fedonski. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a doctoral researcher of pronatalist policies and discourses at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention here at Oxford. Before I continue, can just someone online confirm that you can hear me fine? Yes, okay, perfect. So this panel discussion is part of the CSOC seminar series, and it's on a topic that's very close to my heart, the topic of population aging in the Balkans, in Southeast Europe. We'll be exploring it tonight from a couple of different angles, and we'll have some very interesting speakers, I think, tonight from different disciplines. But before I introduce tonight's topic and tonight's speakers, I just wanted to draw your attention to another event that we will be holding next week. So exactly 1 week from now, next Wednesday, we'll have another panel on all things Balkans, really from many different perspectives. And it's for our anniversary. So CSOCs, our center, is celebrating 20 years of existence, and therefore we will invite you to register if you're interested, either in person or online, for next Wednesday's event. And I would also like to thank a couple of people for making this event possible before we continue. So I would like to say thank you to our director, Anastasakis, also to my CSOCs colleague, Manolis Pratsinakis. They were both extremely helpful in helping me develop the concept for tonight's discussion, but also in planning and structuring the discussion. And thank you also to Julie Adams, our administrator, for helping us organize the event. And with that in mind, I would just like to highlight that the discussion is being recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel. Afterwards, the YouTube channel of CSOCs, Southeast European Studies here at Oxford. And now I would like to, without any further ado, briefly introduce tonight's topic. So the reason why we're talking about population aging in the Balkans or in Southeast Europe is because Southeast European populations are already growing older, and demography is becoming a key topic in political and academic debates in the region. From Zagreb to Athens, all three main determinants of the age structure of a population, low fertility, growing life expectancy, and net emigration, are pointing to an increasingly unsustainable share of elderly citizens in the population, with serious ramifications for the future of Southeast European economies and societies. In recent decades, shifting cultural norms around the meaning of family and suboptimal policy configurations for the work-life balance of parents have depressed birth rates far below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman. The life expectancy has been rising dramatically despite the partial and presumably temporary reversal caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then finally, net emigration of mostly working age population has exacerbated the distortive effects of the previous two trends on the age structure of Southeast European populations, in contrast to the mitigating role played by net immigration in some West European countries. Today's session has two main aims. So first, we would like to provide a brief overview of each of these three demographic trends. So low fertility, growing life expectancy, and net emigration. And the second aim is to address the broader implications of these three trends for the intergenerational social contract in Southeast Europe. So we will be hearing from our four brilliant speakers for about an hour, 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we will move into questions and answers, where people in the room and online can ask their questions or make their observations. If you're joining us online, feel free to ask your questions even while the speakers are presenting. I'll be monitoring the questions as they come, but if you would like to pose them to the speakers yourselves, you can also save them for the questions and answers. And now, last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce our four speakers tonight. So I will start with Ariana Doncia, who is an associate professor of demography at the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics. His research covers the demography of the Balkans, with particular focus on Albania and the health transition in developing and transitional societies, including the sex imbalances at birth and female disadvantages in health and mortality in developing countries. Next, and also here in the room, we have Dianos Pacinos, who is a PhD candidate in demography, also at the London School of Economics. Her research focuses on changes in health and mortality during times of socioeconomic and political changes, particularly focusing on the transition from communism to democracy in the Balkan countries. She's interested in understanding the determinants of health, as well as evidence-based policymaking. Next, we have Vladimir Nikitovic, who is Principal Research Fellow and Head of the Center for Demographic Research at the Institute of Social Sciences in Belgrade. Vladimir's research looks into the socioeconomic causes and consequences of demographic trends at the national and subnational level, as well as policies to address depopulation in Serbia and the Western Balkans. And finally, we have Branimariovanovic, who is an economist at the Institute for International Economic Studies in Vienna, and a country expert for Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. Branimir is also, if I may add, a household name in North Macedonia and one of the main faces of the Macedonian left-wing intelligentsia. His current research interests lie mainly around economic inequality, poverty, fiscal policy, taxation, social policies, labor rights, as well as financial crises and post-crisis recoveries. So as you can see, we have a highly diverse panel tonight in terms of expertise, and also somewhat diverse in terms of nationalities as well. So I truly believe that we're in for a fruitful discussion. And with that, I would like to turn over to our first speaker, Professor Ariana Doncia. Ariana, the floor is yours. Ariana, I believe you're still muted. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. What's happening now? Okay. Thanks for the invitation, and it's a very important topic. I've been researching it in the past few years, and what I want to tell today the audience and discuss is two aspects. One, as you requested, to look at long-term fertility trends and patterns in the Western Balkans, but also to find which of these three main components that affect population growth and population age and sex structure, which are migration, fertility, and mortality, is important in the Balkans. The reason why I'm doing it, because the theory tells us that long-term low levels of fertility are the major factors in causing population aging in the Western countries, with the 1990 onwards to the present day improvements in old age mortality in some of these countries. So migration hasn't been, until 2017, not seen as an important factor in determining population aging. But due to its nature in the Balkans, it is quite important. Why do we start at the Balkans? Quite rightly, as you said, is because of this, if I use a journalist expression, depopulation of the, not just the Western Balkans, the whole East European countries. And is this average annual growth, and this is since the collapse of communism, in most of these countries been negative, as you can see, and this is in percentage. And I mean, there are some exceptions with Serbia in the early years after the 1990s, but overall there is a negative population growth during this period, even if you take the period as a whole. And this is the reason why. But it's not the growth. I mean, we are worrying about, okay, the growth is negative, but what's happening with the population extraction? And as I said, I'll start with fertility. As you can see, these are the long-term trends in fertility in the Western Balkans. I would like to apologize that I couldn't get the data on Kosovo comparable from the same source with everybody else in the long term. So I'll be focusing on Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, Northern Macedonia, and Serbia. And as you can see here in the long-term trends, I mean, there are a few distinctive features. One of them, and the most important one, all their level of fertility of the Western Balkan countries are below the replacement level, as we called it, of 2.1, with Montenegro having the highest one at the moment, and to, well, not everybody's surprised, but with Albania and Bosnia and Herzegovina having levels at 1.3 and 1.4 in the recent years. Why, to some extent, this is important? Well, this is important to see the transition to this. If you see, there are three groups of countries. If Kosovo was here, it will be with Albania in here, and you have Serbia and Croatia that started already had after the Second World War relatively low fertility compared to Montenegro, Northern Macedonia, Serbia, and Albania, and possibly Kosovo, which had these levels of 6 or 6.5 children at the time. So in terms of the transition, you can see that Albania had a rapid transition, but in a way, in terms of aging, you expect that fertility would not be a possible. Albania would be the youngest population. But when we'll see the rates, that's not the case at present day, because the births, we say that the births of 60 years ago decide the number of people over the age of 60 at present. What is the pattern of fertility in the Balkans? Well, in here we have total fertility rate, and we have the mean age of first birth. So we want to see if the fertility is early fertility, as it used to be in Eastern Europe, not a late fertility. And most of the Western Balkans follow in the this left bottom square, which means that they have relatively low fertility, lowest low fertility, which is the regime of most of European countries, particularly in the South European countries, and relatively entrance to the first birth. And why is this? Well, I can go into detail, but the time doesn't allow us to. But I mean, this is also a specific fertility rate. So you have the ages, and you can see most of these countries behave the same. Even Albania, which has a bit of an early fertility, but by Western European standard, this is relatively early fertility, because the late fertility, a postponement, which we see at the age of 30, would have that the peak would have been somewhere here for most of these countries. So for the same level of fertility, say of 1.5 compared to Italy or Spain or any other South European countries, these countries have a relatively entrance into first birth. It's typical of East European country. It just puts this country in a position of Southern Europe, so Mediterranean, but also Eastern Europe based on their background. And this does the same thing that puts total fertility rate with mean age at first marriage, to see if marriage, because we know that marriage is a strong determinant, enters into marriage or cohabitation, but this is marriage. And again, a similar pattern that the reason early entrance into marriage in Albania, more in Albania and in North Macedonia rather than the other countries, but still compared to the others, it's relatively early. Albania has a distinctive feature that I won't go into these. It's got features which have to do with some of the tradition of the society. So we have a total fertility rate between 1.3 and 1.8, and 1.7 is the Montenegro. So, I mean, by all standards, it's really very low fertility, or as we call in demography, lowest low. How were these levels achieved? Well, continuous decline in trend is the main thing, which includes Serbia and Croatia, and to some extent, Montenegro and Bosnia and Herzegovina, the latest stage, but rapid decline in Albania and Kosovo. The second main feature is that it is an early age pattern, still, I'm sorry, of fertility. I won't go in mortality because that's Diana's area that she'll be talking about it. But one thing to mention, just to flag it, is that the Western Balkans live long. They have very long life expectancies. For men between 71 and 76, for women between 75 and 81. Sorry. Again, I don't want to go in the detail of migration, but I've got to flag it that these countries have had different trends of and patterns of migration over the year. And data is a major issue, as my colleague will explain that later. We only have estimates in between censuses to do these estimates, assuming that death and birth registration are all right. But the overall trend is a negative net migration. Let me show this negative net migration. All these trends of the Western Balkan countries are negative. What does that mean? It means that for the growth rate of the population, the net migration, people leaving the country compared to people coming in the country is the main thing. And you can see you have the events, you have here an early high level of migration from Montenegrins, but in the mid-1990s, you see two countries, you see Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, for the reasons which we know. Albania had a strong civil unrest and Bosnia was involved in a war. But as you can see, negative migration over the years. What does that do to population structure? I just took Albania, but I could have taken a lot of countries. Look, Albania was a very young population when the communists collapsed. Then migration starts and fertility continues to reduce. Then migration further continues, slimming the population structure, and fertility continues. And this is, this is the last one, the 2019 estimates. And look at the level of fertility, what it has. Now, this age structure is affected by migration, but migration has also affected fertility per se. So we have done research which shows that migration has a direct effect on population structure, but also an effect on the level of fertility. Okay, so where are we in the Western Balkans? Long lives, very low fertility, and very high migration. This is the population over 60 in the Western Balkans. This is where we are. So we are in a situation that most of this country, the population over 60 is 20% of the overall population, so relatively high. With, you see here, you see Croatia, which is about 27, 28, and the others are coming fast. You see here, Albania is coming fast, And you see here North Macedonia is coming fast. So let's look at another graph, which shows where are we going to be in terms of projections, because we do projections. And the projections, not far away, we're talking 2040, which are very accurate projections. We're talking about less than 20 years from now. And what you can see is that most of these percentages are well above 25 from the UN or Eurostat or our own projections. And this shows that the population will be an issue. The population aging will be an issue. So I want to show you recent research for a couple of minutes to say that, okay, in Serbia and Croatia, the long-term trends of fertility are the main cause of population aging, most likely. But in the countries with very high rates of migration, such as Albania, where or Kosovo for that matter, or Bosnia and Herzegovina, where large groups of population have migrated. I mean, in the case of Albania, 1/3 of the population of 1989 has migrated. So what does that do in terms of population age? So what we did is that we ran a model. We went to 1989, where the communists collapsed, and we projected that today's population, looking at the effect of migration, if the others remain constant, looking at the effect of fertility, if the others remain constant, and looking at the levels of effect of mortality, if the others remain constant. And what we did is we looked at the effect on population growth and the effect on population aging. The indicator we took for the population age, as I'll show, is we took dependency ratio. We did the population 60, but it's the same. If you look in here, this is the actual growth of population over the years in Albania from 1989 to 2019. As you can see here, this drop coincides, it's not just the 1997, but it is further bit later. And as you can see, if you look at the migration effect, where everything else is constant, it's just very similar in terms of the ups and downs with the annual growth. So migration is clearly showing that it's determining the population growth. How about population aging? Again, here we have a very similar trend. This is the effect of, this is the overall, the actual dependency ratio. This is the fertility effect. And as you can see, this is the migration effect. So you can see that fertility as well as migration, but more into the old age dependency ratio. The reason why I put old age dependency ratio is that you eliminate the population under 15. And when you do the old age dependency ratio, migration take precedence. So the migration effect is much more closer to the effect of a real, where the population would have been, rather than the other two components. So mortality effect minimal, migration and fertility most important. By migration has affected very much the speed of aging in the last 30 years. So I'll just say two sentences. Well, the future policies, and then we'll discuss it. I mean, the intention in the Balkans has been that focus on the young people, focus on the young people. We need to focus on the elderly, very much so, on all aspects of socioeconomic context. And I'll close here because I think I already took 20 minutes. Sorry about the time.
Thank you so much, Arjan. I think that was very concise and crystal clear and very informative. I would like to now turn over to Dijana then here in the room to talk about the mortality aspect of population aging in the Balkans.
Thank you very much. So in the next few minutes, I'll talk about the general trends of change in life expectancy, as well as what contributed to this change. And then I would like to spend some time to talk about the risk factors among the population, which will be an indication for future health of the population. And then to talk a bit about the gender disparities that we see in mortality. And finally, what could be the implications to society that we can consider for policy. So the countries that I'm discussing are the same countries that Arjan discussed, but I have included also Slovenia because in general it followed similar trends as the remaining countries, but currently has higher life expectancy than this. So it's a good comparator when we are comparing in terms of lifestyle factors or health policies and preventive measures that they have taken. So in general, in the region, life expectancy has been increasing both for males and females. It's really interesting that during the years of transition, life expectancy did not dip for males the same way that it did for other Eastern European countries, but it continued to increase maybe at a slower rate, or there was a minimal change of less than a year for certain countries, but it did not follow the same trends that it did in Eastern Europe. So currently, the life expectancy in the region, the gap between these countries for males is five years between the best performing countries. So for example, Slovenia was the leader in 2017, which is the year to which I did this decomposition of mortality analysis, with 78.3 years, and the lowest was Serbia with 73.2 years for males. For females, the gap is a bit bigger between the countries. So we have 6 years difference between the best performing countries, which is Slovenia, which is the life expectancy for females is 84.1 year. And this is relatively high life expectancy even in the European context. Slovenia has a higher than the European average life expectancy for females. The remaining countries have life expectancy that is below the European average, and actually females in this region live the shortest in Europe. So that's why I would like to focus one part on the gender disparities that we're observing. Some of the contributions to these changes in mortality. So the composition analysis shows that majority of these changes in the 2000s, so from 2007 to 2017, can be contributed to reductions in circulatory diseases, so cardiovascular diseases, some improvements due to cancer. For males, it's particularly interesting in the adult age group from 15 to 44 years. There has been a reduction in external causes of death, particularly traffic accidents, and in some countries that has been achieved through investments in infrastructure, while in other countries that have been achieved through campaigns that are looking to change the behavior of people, such as focusing on campaigns to not consume alcohol while driving and looking at speeding. What is interesting to observe in these countries is that for some countries we are seeing slowing down into the increases in life expectancy, especially for females, and this is particularly interesting given, for example, in North Macedonia and in Bosnia, that the life expectancy is below 80. So if we know in the context of Europe, this is not a very high life expectancy, but we are already seeing a plateauing. So that is something that needs to be considered because it cannot simply be attributed to delayed epidemiological transition to more non-communicable diseases. Another thing that is very interesting in terms of diseases that are prevalent in the region is the reduction, as I said, the reduction in circulatory diseases. But we're seeing in countries such as Slovenia and Croatia that have decreased the number of circulatory diseases, that there is an increase in the number of cancers. So we are moving from one type of non-communicable diseases to other type of non-communicable diseases, and both types require a lot of investment in healthcare and a lot of treatment for a longer period of time, and that's why we'll talk about that part later in the talk. We're seeing big disparities in the mortality rates between the countries. So for example, I have taken Slovenia as an example for cardiovascular diseases. It has 225 deaths per 100,000 for men, while for North Macedonia, that number is 533 deaths per 100,000. So that is a big difference that we are seeing. So one of the reasons how this can be explained is looking at the risk factors that are known risk factors for these diseases. So for example, considering tobacco consumption, smoking, alcohol consumption, obesity, physical activity, and so on. So I have taken here some data to share with you on risk factors, but it's really interesting to observe that smoking prevalence is in general very high for the whole region. So we have, for example, Slovenia, 28% of the adult population that are male smokes. In Albania, that number goes up to 60%. We see for females similar trends. In Croatia, we see 34% of the adult female population smokes. But in Albania, we see a lower, for example, which is 12%. Now here there is an interesting trend that overall smoking is decreasing in the countries, but not at the same speed. And for example, implementation of well-known preventive measures, and for example, the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, if there is a full implementation of this framework in the next 5 years, this number could decrease by 30%. But in some countries, such as Macedonia and Albania, what is really interesting, we observe that there is an increase in the number of females that are smoking. Now, why is this really interesting? This is really interesting because it is seen, especially among educated women, which is not a trend that we see in the world. And now this could indicate that this is linked to a social symbol, because in these countries, the smoking was predominantly seen among the males. So now women, as they become empowered, they're doing the same thing. Other risk factors, for example, that we see are alcohol consumption. So Slovenia has one of the highest alcohol consumptions in Europe, with 18.3 liters per year consumed by male. Then we see very high heavy episodic drinking, with more than 60% of the male in Slovenia have recorded that in the past 30 days they have consumed a lot of alcohol. And then we see a lot of obesity among the population, which is increasing, going to up to 23%. Now, why I have spent time to discuss these risk factors is because this indicates that the population that is aging is very exposed to these risk factors. So we can anticipate that in the future they will develop some of the diseases that are linked to these risk factors, such as cardiovascular diseases, such as neoplasms. And as I said, in some countries, these numbers are high currently. And if there's no investments in preventive measures, then these numbers might continue to either stagnate at the high level or continue to increase. So that would mean that the population will reach older ages, but not be very healthy, which will require a lot of treatment. So looking at the gender disparities in mortality that exist in this region, it's very interesting because it's a bit different from what we observed in Europe. So in the European Union, usually there is a greater gender gap between in the countries that have higher mortality. So with that, for instance, if we take that logic, we would expect that Slovenia, which has the lowest mortality out of these countries, that the gap will be the smallest. However, this is not the case in these countries. It's actually quite the opposite. So we see in Croatia and Slovenia that the sex gap is almost 6 years, while other countries such as North Macedonia and Albania is 3 years and almost 4 years in North Macedonia. Now, this is an interesting finding and something that we need to consider, because it is not this gap in this reduction in the gap in these countries such as Albania and Macedonia is not attributable to males reaching very high life expectancy, but it's attributable to the fact that females are stagnating just under 80 years of life expectancy, and males are approaching that level. And so here it's really important to think in the context of the role, the position of females in the society. So, for example, females in this, especially aging females in the older populations, might have less, because traditionally they were underrepresented in the workforce. They might have either lower pensions or not have pensions that are adequate to meet their needs for treatment. So maybe that is one of the reasons why they're not reaching this life expectancy that we see in the other countries. As we see currently, again, female participation in the workforce is not equal with men. Females are paid less. We see females being in a lower paid jobs. So it is possible that in the future this trend might continue unless something is done in this country. These countries that will help females to achieve that higher life expectancy. And one thing that I want to highlight is that it's important to consider the diversity between the different groups that exist in the country. So, for example, if we're talking about female advantage, it's important to know that there are some women in society that are particularly disadvantaged, such as the Roma woman. For example, 83% of the Roma women in Macedonia have never been employed, and 39% of them have not completed the education that is mandatory by the country. So all of these implications really highlight that in some countries maybe the women are more disadvantaged, and that's why we are not observing the high life expectancy as we're seeing in the other countries. So finally, what are the implications of these findings for the future? So the first one is really the economic cost of non-communicable diseases. So we can talk about cost in terms of public spending on healthcare, but we can also talk about cost in the terms of societal perspective, for example, non-healthcare costs such as productivity losses. So if we have populations that are not as healthy and they have an onset of these diseases such as cardiovascular diseases and cancers earlier on, then they might prolong their life with the technological advancements that we have, with the medicines that are available, but they might not be able to participate to a full extent into the workforce. And another thing that I think will link well with the next talk about migration is that a lot of the work in these countries and a lot of the care is informal care that comes from these social relationships that exist. And given the high rates of migration, especially in the younger populations, then we have an aging populations and old people, but there are no provisions for this type of care. So that is something that needs to be taken into consideration when making policies about these people. And finally, as I said, it's the cost to the individuals of these treatments and available medicines that exist. So some studies done by WHO European office suggest that 6.5% of the household in North Macedonia experience catastrophic out-of-pocket payments, which means that total health expenditure equals or exceeds 40% of the total household capacity to pay. And this is particularly important because it's mostly seen in households that have at least one member that is age 60 or above. This is mainly driven by outpatient medicine. And so this is again something that the country will need to consider when thinking about policies in the future and diseases. And finally, the social implications of the aging populations, and again links to migration, is the social isolation that people are facing. And so some of the highest rates of mental health problems leading to self-harm are noted among people who are facing social isolation, especially older men and widowed people. So it is important to think how to reestablish those social networks, especially as migration is a big problem. So to conclude all of that, while life expectancy is increasing, it is important to invest in preventive measures that will ensure that there is a good physical and mental health for the population, to make sure that the population is as healthy as possible until they reach the older ages. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. That was really excellent, and thank you for the smooth transition that you have enabled for us towards the migration aspect of our discussion. In the meantime, let me just remind everyone online that they can ask their questions in the Q&A box if they so wish, or they can save them for the questions and answers and ask them directly. And now I would like to move to Vladimir to tell us about the influence of migration on population aging in Balkans. Vladimir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kristijan. Thank you for inviting me to this very interesting event. And of course, I will just try to share my presentation. It will be much easier. Okay. Okay. Unlike the previous two presentations, for mine, it was not easy to rely on such reliable data as those coming from fertility and mortality field. But thanks to the Arjan who made a very great introduction about the migration trends in the Western Balkans, maybe I will skip some explanations I was planning to make during the presentation. So what I'm going to talk about during this 10 to 15 minutes. As I already said, data issues, it's a quite big question when it comes to migration, specifically in the regions like the Western Balkans that are typically net sending regions. So it's the first topic. The second would be that strong impact of migration on the size and structure of the young generation. Why young generation? We saw on those slides that Arjan previously presented, because you know that population aging comes from both sides of the population pyramid. And in this region, it's particularly important to focus on that bottom side of the population pyramid. As Arjan said, fertility is particularly important, but it seems that migration, particularly in the last 2 to 3 decades, becomes ever more important in this way. So when you look at these population aging indicators, one of the main reasons for those average numbers is the impact of migration, of course. So another interesting topic is changing patterns of the recent migration between the Western Balkans and Europe, which seems to be happening during the last 10 years. And finally, just a quick one glance at the prospects that might expect from the adjusted data that I used from the United Nations population prospects. And to go in medias res, as we saw earlier, the whole region is quite far from this conjunction point. So that's why, simply talking, we are still stuck somewhere in this phase where the immigration really dominates immigration, and that's the huge problem. What I wanted to show today, because data from this region in terms of population in a whole are still depending on a single source. It's traditional census of population. So even those estimates made by the relevant agencies, world agencies, rely on very distant census years, as it's the case now. For example, only Croatia and North Macedonia had the census count recently. So I show this slide where you have a census as something most updated at the moment against these estimates that were made just before the COVID pandemic. And as you can see, the biggest underestimation is really exactly in this age bracket. So it suggests that migration could be the main reason. Of course, it could be also the COVID pandemic effect in these older ages, but for us, it is something that is very important at the moment. The similar thing you can notice for North Macedonia, and even more pronounced in this age bracket. If you contrast it with Slovenian slide, you will see the opposite in this age bracket. It's not so pronounced because their data are more updated because of the register-based census. So as you can see, just from these 3 slides, you will see how big is the effect of migration only 10 years if you are rely on a very distant census accounts. So if I use the only one reliable data for Serbia at the moment to show you what is the age distribution of emigrants and immigrants according to the statistics from their statistical office. And as you can see, it's dominated by immigrants in these ages that I mentioned. This is the youngest and the most productive, to be precise, the most productive and the age bracket where the reproductive population is concentrated. As Arjan said, you have also, because of that indirect effect of emigration. So, and of course, you have that retirement migration, which is quite close to that theoretical line. So, of course, it would be quite opposite in the countries, as we call it, new member states from the Central East European countries, that you at the moment don't have this peak for retirement migration. But at the moment, I didn't have a proper slide for that. But never mind, I will just skip to this table. Just focus, this is a calculation from the United Nations World Population Prospects. This region, you see it's that in political terms, Western Balkans, as you can see, it's about 17.5 million total population. And this is the share of the youth. The region is younger comparing to the EU, but of course, differences are quite pronounced, and they're really based on different onset of the demographic transition and their duration of that process. So, but if one make adjustment based on this underestimation of migration effect, as I did for this slide, you will see that it could be possible that the population of the region at the moment is smaller by 1.1 million, and we will see maybe the census that will be held, we suppose, all during this year in the rest of the countries showed the same. Okay, now I'm going to the second topic. It's about, I titled that Changing Nature of Migration Flows. What does it mean? Because of the problem with the data, I focused on that administrative data sources from the Eurostat database, and because it offers the less missing points, and you can use some simple indicators. For example, the ratio between the total first permits issued to, in this case, Serbian citizens, and all valid permits, just to see what's going on between the short-term and the long-term migration. In simple way, it means that, for example, the higher this ratio, the higher the higher share of the short-term and permanent and the temporary migration, and vice versa. So these green numbers shows the typical traditional countries of Serbian immigrants, where this ratio is quite low. It is on the opposite side, you have these new member states where there is a rising share. If you are look at the table from the 2011 to 2019, just discard 2020 because of the pandemic, and you will see it's rising in all new member states and in Germany. And I will speak about why it might be, what reasons might be for that. And as you can see, for the European Union as a whole, that ratio, it was small because of those traditional countries, but it even because of those new member states raised, even for the average of the EU, even tripled during this period. It's in a way similar for Albania. Of course, some differences about destination countries, typical destination countries, but more or less it's the similar pattern. If you look at these first resident permits according to reason, you will see something that couldn't be easily seen maybe from this first slide. For example, family reunion was the most frequent reason in all Western Balkan populations 10 years ago. And there is a clear declining trend in this reason across the whole region. Its share in the total first resident permits dropped to, as you can see, just above the quarter in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. At the same time, you had the rise in the permits issued for the reason of work. It even doubled or tripled depending on country, except in Albania. But working permits are far more frequent in new EU member states, while family-related are dominant, for example, for Serbian migrants and for most of other countries in the region in all member states. So generally, all the destinations, we might say, that show some kind of stagnation or declining trend in total inflow, but their work-to-family ratio is quite low. And you will see, for example, for Serbia, those green numbers, suggesting that the family reunion reason dominate. In Germany, it's quite opposite. There is a strong rise in the first-time work permits for since 2016, and it coincided with the introduction of the so-called Western Balkan regulation that Germany introduced in January 2016, and that regulation notably simplified the procedure for migrants from this region, those without professional qualifications, to work in this country. But even in that case, I might say that that ratio is still lower, much lower than the average for the EU, but it's rising, unlike the shares for other new member states. So it's, as you can see, similar in Bosnia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, in Albania, but for Kosovo, it's the only exception. It seems that this process might be just at the beginning. There could be multiple reasons for growing flows and stocks of migrants from the Western Balkans in the new member states, but it seems that there is no real potential of these countries for attracting permanent immigration from this region. I see two main reasons for that. There is no proactive policy towards permanent immigration in these countries, of course, except for foreign nationals who belong to their own ethnicity. But also those countries are still not largely recognized as desirable long-term destinations, except for Slovenia, of course, for its long historical and cultural ties with the region. So in a way, if you look at these tables, for example, I will come back to some more clear numbers. You can see that you can put it in any economic concept. For example, if you even put it in the push and pull concept of migration drivers, you can see that after the recovery of the economy in the Western Europe after the 2008 recession, there was a big demand for labor, most strongly in Germany as a kind of the economic locomotive. And this was, of course, in demographic terms, intensified with the retirement of large baby boom generations. And I would say coupled with ever smaller younger generations entering the labor market. So those countries needed to find the sources of labor, and they found it in new member states. On the other side, those new member states from the Central East European faced strong shortages of labor force, and they, of course, turned to low-wage European regions, especially Ukraine and the Western Balkans. So to fill their empty spaces and their needs for labor. So in general, we have that migrations inside the EU from the east to the west, and of course we have that immigration from Western Balkans to these new member states. But of course, it doesn't mean that you also see those lot of green numbers showing low share of work permits, but as you know, all of these countries have a large diasporas in the West, so they use the family visas to enter labor market. So that could be an explanation for some countries or some lower share than it would be than expected. So at the end, I will just skip this again. I will just recap this as you see, the increasing demand for workers in Germany induced new, typically short-term and circular migration of workers. That was not a case in the previous decades from this region to Central and Eastern European countries. These outflows accelerated after 2015. Of course, in case of Germany, it was I think it was speeded up with this Western Balkan regulation. And as you can see, the increasing share of working permits on account of decreasing of the family reunion is noticeable throughout the region. And finally, these trends suggest that the nature of migration in the Western Balkans obviously changes, but okay, there is a time we will see what's going on because the migration is the most volatile factor of population dynamics. And this is the final slide for this presentation. I just use this United Nations Population Division projections and scale them according to the technique I used for the first slide, just to see what we can expect according to their medium variant or the most probable case. And as you can see, the strongest decrease is expected for those younger age groups, and it's something that, as we heard, should be taken account by the policymakers. I will just see if I put some of these recommendations. Yes, it is that reducing net immigration should be an immediate policy task, and the stable net immigration, the ultimate policy goal across the region. If you see, there are some migration concepts like those by Heinz Fassmann, that there is some cycle, and that sooner or later the whole Europe will become an immigration continent. And if you are looking at for example, the Eurostat projections, Europop, they also implicitly say that even Croatia, Bulgaria, and Romania, who are now typical net sending countries, will in 15 to 20 years become net immigration countries. So in that context, given the similarities in historic and economic development, we could expect at some for politicians to realize it could be, and it should be, the ultimate policy goal across the whole region. Yeah, thank you. It would be all for this from my side.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. That was very detailed, and I'm sure very well new to most of us, because there was a lot of not very well commonly circulated information there. Okay, now we're going to turn over to Branimir, who in some ways has the most difficult task perhaps on tonight's panel, because he's supposed to sort of summarize the different demographic trends and look at how they impact the socioeconomics of our region and what sorts of challenges we can expect in that regard for policymakers. So Branimir, over. Yes, Branimir, over to you.
Sorry, I forgot how to turn on my microphone while my screen is shared. So just a second, we've been doing this stuff for 2 years, but we still keep on forgetting stuff. Maybe we are getting old simply. Okay, now let's move to the presentation. So thanks, Kristijan, for inviting me to this event, and hello everyone, greetings from Vienna. It's a real pleasure for me to be part of this event. So I'll be speaking about the socioeconomic challenges arising from aging and from the demographic decline in Southeast Europe. And of course, there are many things to say here, but I'll try to focus on 2 main issues. And in the discussion, in the Q&A session, we can maybe open some other things. And I'll start with this photo. So I'm sure some of you know this person. So this is Robert Solow, and that's one of the biggest economists in the 20th century, or maybe ever, I would say. And he won the Nobel Prize in 1989, if I'm not wrong. And he's 97 years old currently, and he's still active. And he's best known in economics and probably in other areas for his growth theories, for his contribution to growth theory, or basically the theory of explaining why some countries grow faster than some other countries. And his best known model in economics is this one, Very simple, of course. It tells you that output or GDP or national income, this is Y, is a function of the capital that a country has, the number of the technology, A, and then the labor or the workforce in the country. So basically 3 things determine your, let's say, level of development or income or GDP growth: capital, technology, and labor. Or put in other words, national income is a positive function of labor, or the higher the labor, the higher the national income in a country will be. Why is this important? Because if you look at the population or let's say labor in Southeast Europe, you can see that it's declining. It's already declining in most of the countries. Previous participants mentioned this in one way or another. I'll just show some additional figures which are similar to the figures that were shown before. So these are population forecasts and historical data and forecasts from the UN population division forecasts. Previous speakers mentioned this one as well. So we can see this is for Albania. We can see that Albania has been going through a trend of demographic decline for the last several, I don't know, decades or something, starting from 1990 or whatever. And the expectations are that it will continue. So you see the blue line shows you what is the expectation. So the expectation for Albania is that the population will continue declining in the next century or so. It's very similar in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's very similar in Bulgaria. It's very similar in Croatia. Very similar in Romania. Very similar in Serbia. Slightly different in Montenegro, because in Montenegro you see that the decline has not started yet, but the population is on a plateau, but it will start inevitably in the next decade or so. And North Macedonia is very similar to Montenegro. It's on the, let's say, plateau, and the population is declining, at least according to this data. According to the census data that were published a couple of months ago, probably the country, North Macedonia, is also on a declining trend. I don't have data for Kosovo for a very known reason. United Nations doesn't include Kosovo in their statistics, but let's leave that aside. So what is the important thing from here? If so we know that population is expected to continue declining in Southeast Europe, and that means that economic growth in the region will slow down. So countries will not continue to grow as fast as they used to grow, but their growth is expected to slow down. And the countries were not growing fast either in recent years or so. So this figure is showing you basically the convergence in terms of income, national income, in 3 groups of Eastern European countries or economies. So the full line here, the red line here, are the Baltic countries. And you can see that the line here is pretty upward sloping, pretty growing. And you can see that basically the latest number here is around, I don't know, 85%, meaning that average income in Baltic countries right now is around 85% of the income in EU countries. So basically Baltic countries are converging and are very close to the European level of income. And you can see that in 95, their average level of income was around, I know, 30% of the EU level. In the last 30 years, they managed to basically catch up virtually completely. So from 30% to almost 85%. It's very similar with the Visegrad countries. It's the second line here. So Visegrad countries are right now at around 80% of EU level of income, with that difference that they were slightly more developed than the Baltic countries in the 90s. So they started from a higher level, but they are converging. They are catching up with Western Europe, let's say, or developed Europe, of course. And the third group here is the Southeast Europe, the 9 economies of Southeast Europe, which includes the 6 Western Balkan economies, plus Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria. And you can see that this region has been the slowest one in terms of convergence. And right now it's around 50% of European level of income. We have to say also here that if we exclude Croatia and Romania and Bulgaria, or include only the Western Balkan countries, the percentage here is not 50, it's around 30% or something like that, around 40. So if we exclude, let's say, the European Union member states, Southeast Europe or Western Balkans are even worse than here. So basically, these countries have not been converging to EU levels of income. And if we bear in mind what I said previously, that their economic growth will slow down in the years to come, that means that this convergence will slow down, or at least will not speed up. So basically, we cannot expect the convergence to EU levels to come anytime soon if things don't change dramatically in the next period. So that's the first thing that I want to mention. The second thing that I want to talk about is this one. It's about old age dependency ratio. Some of the previous speakers mentioned this already. I'll just repeat it. That is my, let's say, elaboration, because I don't have to explain it into details. But old age dependency ratio basically measures the share of old people to the share of non-old people. I know this is about a bit of ages, so but I'm explaining, I'm using the old terms, let's say. In modern terms, it's basically population above 65 years of age as a share of the working age population, or population usually 15 to 64 years of age. Why is this important? Because it tells you how much of the people in your country or in your economy are not contributing actively to the income that you're generating in the country, but are living out of passive income. Why passive income? Because people who are, let's say, not working, they live off pensions, which is income that they have saved through their lifetime, but it's not income that they are generating right now. And why is this important? Why is this ratio important? Because it higher, let's say, share of older people in the total population, or higher old age dependency ratio, calls for greater role of the government in the economy, or for greater redistribution. Why? Because first of all, you need to pay pensions to these people, and second, they usually have higher health costs, so you need to pay for their higher health costs. So old age dependency is important because it calls for more active government in the economy, which means more redistribution or more social spending. So how are the Western Balkans faring in terms of old age dependency? Here I'm showing just the Western Balkans. I omitted Bulgaria, Croatia, and Romania. What we can see here, Kosovo is not included again because it's not included in the UN data. And so we can see here that all the Western Balkan economies have been on an upward trend in terms of old age dependency ratio. So you can see that in 1990s, the ratio was between, I don't know, 9% and 14%. Now the latest number is between 20 and 29%. So even the worst country in 1990 is much better than the best country right now. So basically, population is aging in all these countries, and we have higher old age dependency ratio in all Western Balkan economies. Okay, nothing terrible, let's say, nothing new. We all know this. How is this relative to EU, or let's say Euro area? Let's take the rich part or developed part of EU. We can see that the Western Balkans are still better than the Euro area. So the worst, let's say, from the Western Balkan countries, Serbia has old age dependency of around 28 or 29% here, which is, I would say, pretty better than the Euro area, which is around 32%. So you would say, yeah, it's not a problem because it's still, the ratio is still better than in EU, but it's not really like that for several reasons. The first one is that if you look at the trend, you can see that the upward trend in the Western Balkans, it's much more steeper than in the Euro area, meaning that Western Balkan countries are aging faster than Euro area countries. So that means that in some time, very soon, let's say, these countries will catch up Euro area in this sense. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that the social structures or the social systems in the Western Balkan countries are very much different from the social systems in the developed European countries. What do I mean here? If you look at total government spending as a share of GDP, we can see that, let's say, rich or developed EU countries like Germany and Austria have more than 1/2 of their GDP as government expenditure, or let's say the state budgets, the government budgets in developed Europe are more than 1/2 of the total GDP. So let's take the whole income that is generated in one country in 1 year, more than 1/2 of that in Western Europe or developed Europe is taken by the government and then redistributed for social policies, pensions, healthcare, education, all kind of stuff. If you look at that percentage in Eastern Europe, or let's say in Southeast Europe, the countries that I'm analyzing here, you can see that the share is much smaller. Croatia is the only country which comes closer to developed Europe, and of course it's an EU country, but everybody else is much worse. Serbia, which is the second best, let's say, has share of 46%, which is still much lower, significantly lower than the share in Germany or Austria. Countries like Kosovo, Albania, or North Macedonia have around 30 or 30-something% of GDP as government spending, which is far, far lower than developed Europe. So social systems in Western Balkans and Southeast Europe are much, much smaller, much, let's say, redistributive than social systems in Western European countries. And this is a crucial difference. Why is this the case? Because it's not just spending, it's also revenues. Public revenues or taxation, let's say taxes in Southeast Europe are much lower than taxes in Western Europe or developed Europe. So you see here the total government revenues or total taxes that each of these countries is generating as a share of GDP. Again, we can see that in Germany and Austria, it's almost 49% or something of GDP, whereas Albania, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Romania have just around 30% of their GDP as government taxes. So Eastern European or Southeast European and Western Balkan economies, they collect much less taxes than Western Europe, and because of that they spend much less on social things, and because of that they cannot afford to have let's say aging of the population as Western European countries. And we already see the problems. So this figure shows you the poverty rate or at risk of poverty rate in Europe. We see the Western Balkan countries here. Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, Turkey, North Macedonia, we can see that poverty in all of these countries is above 22%, which is much higher than other EU countries. The worst from the EU countries are again Southeast European countries, Bulgaria and Romania, who have very similar poverty rates as Western Balkan countries. So basically, if you take Southeast Europe together, they all have poverty rates of around 22 to 25%. If you take the rest of EU, they have poverty of, I don't know, 16, 15% or something like that. So poverty is already much higher in Southeast Europe than in Western Europe with the current, let's say, social systems, and with the aging of the population that we will see in the current period, in the years or in decades to come, things will only get worse because governments will need to collect more money in order to spend more on social affairs. But if they don't collect that money, social aspects like poverty and all other stuff will only get worse. So I'm trying to conclude now. Some of the tentative conclusions would be that aging and demographic decline is a serious problem in Southeast Europe. It slows down economic growth. And Southeast Europe is already having problems with economic growth or convergence to Western Europe. It's also a problem because of it emphasizes the need for higher government spending on social affairs, or let's say more redistribution from the government. And Southeast European countries do not have big governments. They have, on the other hand, very small governments and very small redistribution. And if they don't change that anytime soon, we will have further escalation in their social outcomes like poverty, which are already very bad. So that's all from me. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Branimir. That was really excellent. And I think we'll particularly appreciated how tailored your presentation was to a sort of broader audience and how you avoided some of the more technical discussion and made it really easy to follow. Thank you. I think now we can give a round of applause for all of our speakers. So I suggest that we first take the two written questions in the chat, then we'll move back to the room, and then we'll go back online in case anyone has a direct question to ask for the speakers. So let us look, can we maybe project the questions in the chat?
Yeah, they're not.
Is it possible to ask them to ask the question themselves, please?
Yes, but they're not questions, they're just remarks. Okay, well, that makes my job easier, I suppose. In that case, we will start with the room. So if there are any questions in the room for our speakers on any aspect of tonight's panel, please feel free to ask it now. David?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentations. I'm David Madden, CSOCS. Are there any other regions of the world, or indeed individual countries, which have the same mix of problems affecting their population? Have they been able to do anything about it? And are there lessons there for Southeast Europe?
And maybe we can take a question from Kimea as well, and then go back to the speakers.
Hi, I'm Timea Suda from the Department of Social Policy. I specialise in fertility in the Western Balkans. So it's nice to hear from the other two sides of the triad. I have a question for the second speaker regarding health interventions. Specifically, I'm interested in what kind of policies have been introduced. You mentioned some of the drink driving stuff. It'd just be nice to learn a little bit more about those interventions and what goes into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimea. Diana, you can answer that now if you want, and maybe add something on the general question.
Yeah, so health interventions. I mean, I can go sort of per disease group. So neoplasms, some of the things that countries have done, particularly Slovenia has done effectively, is screening, so early detection of diseases. One of their more successful screening programs is breast cancer screening program. They have put a lot of emphasis on integration of health services, where they're looking at community involvement, and so they're looking at a community level, community health centers in terms of these interventions. Then circulatory diseases, there have been efforts, for example, in Montenegro to reduce salt intake, because in the region, the salt intake is 11 grams per person, while WHO recommendation is 5 grams per person. So it's almost as double. And they have emphasized the multi-sectorial collaboration between different sectors to do that. So for example, they try to talk to the bakery industry, because actually bread in these countries have a lot of salt. So they have tried to work with them. They have tried to work with the agricultural sector, but the success was very limited, because it was not very clear for these industries what is their incentive of why they should change, and just presenting it as a preventive measure was not an incentive enough. In terms of external causes of that, I mentioned, and then in the other countries such as Macedonia and Montenegro, infant mortality is still a problem. While it is very low, it is high for Europe. So we have a 9 per 1,000. For example, that's and some of the measures that they have taken is introducing more breastfeeding trainings, trying to make delivery rooms family friendly, and so on. So there is a big range that has been introduced in countries, but the extent to which they're introduced is quite different in the countries, and the extent to which their follow through is different, as well as the timing when they were introduced. So some were started in 2007 and 8, some are starting only now, and that really has an impact on the outcomes. In terms of the first question, should I just leave it to? Question? Okay, so other regions that face the same problems, I spent my research, particularly I'm interested in comparing with other Eastern European countries, and I've noticed that there are some differences in mortality trends that we're observing, in terms that these countries of the Balkan region actually perform better than the Central and Eastern European countries, but then they lag behind the European Union. So that's quite interesting in terms of mortality, in terms of differences.
Thank you. Maybe we can move to Arjan now. Arjan, which region in the world, if any, is the most similar one to the Balkans in terms of fertility trends?
Well, I mean, I'll take one by one, not just fertility. In terms of negative growth has been present in the whole of Eastern Europe, starting with Russia very early on. What makes that kind of negative growth, what affects that are different reasons. Low levels of fertility, the Western Balkans saw somewhere in between Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. Southern Europe in the fact that the fertility went down dramatically very fast in some of the Western Balkans, and Eastern Europe because some of the countries had relatively slow reduction in fertility, but also in terms of pattern of fertility. First birth very early, second birth later on. Migration is a bit difficult because if you go in history, we have had huge migration flows. I can mention the Irish after the potato crisis. You can mention the Italians after the Second World War. But I mean, negative migration growth, even countries such as UK have had negative migration growth until the late 1980s, which means that there have been countries that have been giving the world more. But one thing which I would mention, which is linked to this question, is I think to some extent, Branimir mentioned in one of his conclusions, is what we call demographic dividend. And all these Western Balkan countries didn't make use of the demographic dividend, which means a lot of people in the working age group, which allowed a lot of countries in the world that made use of it to develop what the economists called an extensive economy with a large labor and low cost. And the Balkans lost that opportunity, at least Albania, the Western Balkans, probably not Serbia, but even Serbia that. So they've lost that opportunity of demographic dividend. Other countries that made use of it, from China to Japan, the first Western European country, because of the fast transition in demographically, they made use of demographic dividend. And there are lots of other countries. I mean, it's to make that comparison, it goes on for ages.
Vladimir, do you have anything to add?
Not much. Arjan covered the most of the topics, but indeed, this part of the world was the first to face the lowest fertility levels in the world. It's well known. For example, Serbia, Croatia, Hungary had among the shortest baby boom periods after the Second World War. So it really impacts this age structure lately, but also, as he said about this dividend, for example, those big immigration waves of so-called guest workers or gastarbeiters that were happening since the mid-60s also made a great impact on today's age structure. So if you have that and that indirect effect of that immigration waves, so if you couple it with the 60 years or the below fertility level, it's no wonder that you have these declining and shrinking populations in this region. And of course, you have other factors, for example, the wars and crises in the region now from the eastern part of Europe throughout the southern. We had those wars in the 90s and now the current war. And it's happening in this region and their surroundings. So it also pretty much affects these declining trends in the population and, of course, the population aging.
Branimir, would you like to add something?
Well, I can add just some small stuff, let's say. So I think aging from economic point of view is not a problem which is unique to the Southeast Europe. It's actually a common problem in whole of Europe and many developed countries. Many of the OECD countries are facing the same issue. And because of that, what economists are doing, or let's say policymakers from economic are doing, is that there's a greater need for government intervention or redistribution, like I said. And if you look at the trends in public spending or social spending in EU or OECD countries, they're increasing. So they're everywhere increasing. And that's what these countries are doing. Another thing which some of the countries are trying to do, or let's say these developed countries in general trying to do, is they're trying to attract people from other countries, like allow migration in order to, let's say, improve their demographic profiles. And this is especially the case in some of the EU countries, like Austria, for instance. Austria doesn't have a big aging problem because they have migrants from the Balkans and Eastern Europe and Turkey. And Germany similarly, differently, let's say, from Italy. So that's another thing that they can do. But the Southeast Europe and the Western Balkans are very specific because they are kind of a mix between, let's say, these developed European countries, which have aging of the population, and poor or undeveloped countries, which don't usually have problem with the aging of the population. So usually other regions in the world which are, let's say, as developed as the Western Balkans, or maybe less developed, they don't have problems with aging. So Balkans are a combination, and Eastern Europe is a combination between, let's say, the level of development of other poor regions which don't have problem with aging, and Western Europe, which has problems with aging. So in that sense, I think Balkans and Southeast Europe are pretty unique. And because of that, because of their current level of development, they cannot really do too much about migration, because people are leaving the countries. Nobody wants to come there to live. So it's a very specific case. What some countries are doing and trying to do is in terms of the social policies, let's say, and let's say to remove or reduce the burden on public spending, is they're trying to raise the retirement age, or let's say make people work until they are older. And because of that, they will pay less pensions and they will have higher income. But these policies are very unpopular. You see that there are protests in many countries when they try to do that. Think about France right now. And they're especially problematic in Eastern Europe, which doesn't have, let's say, which has very short lifespan from retirement until, let's say, death. So if you look at the number of years that people spend after retirement, in Eastern Europe, it's around, I don't know, on average, maybe 10 to 15 years, whereas in Western Europe, it's around 20 years. So this is a significant difference. And that makes it even more difficult for Southeast European countries to implement these kind of policies. So I would say that from all these points of view, Southeast Europe and Western Balkans are really in a tough economic situation, and what they can do is just increase the role of government, or raise taxes and increase public spending.
Thank you, Branimir. I believe we have a question online.
Yeah, I think I've got one for me here.
Yes, I will just read it out loud just in case. So it's a technical question for Arjan from Lab about one of his slides that mentioned modeling the outflows of population in Albania after the fall of communism. Which models were used for this purpose?
I'm not quite sure what the question refers to, but what I modeled there is the effect of migration, fertility, and mortality on population change in the past 30 years. So what I did is that I looked in the 1989 as the starting point, and allowing migration as it is and keeping fertility and mortality constant. What I did is that I used a cohort component method, but for the population trends, I looked at the quasi-stable models, as we call them. So I think if the person wants to know more, I'm more than happy to give. My email is pretty known, so he can email me on that. But can I add something that Branimir mentioned? I mean, why are we worried about aging in the Balkans? And well, we are worried for a simple reason. Aging is coming fast compared to the other regions, and B, not in the same level of development that Western Europe had. And that comes on different aspects. I mean, Branimir and also Vladimir also mentioned the elements of the labor force. Pension is the big issue. I mean, we have a pay-as-you-go as we go. The investment in healthcare, which Dijana mentioned, because we know that with aging, with increase of the population in the old age, you increase the burden of disease, of chronic diseases, which are much more expensive than any other disease. But the third point is the social care. Who is going to look after this elderly when people in the middle have left, which is direct effect of migration? And the social care in the Balkans is somehow based on tradition and values. So the children look after the elderly, but there are no children to look after. There are no siblings. In a way, it's a bit like China in that respect, to link it with the other question. And in that case, and we don't have a tradition of institutionalization. We are not like the Anglo-Saxon culture or the Central European culture that people can go in the institution. So what's going to happen? And this is a big question mark. When the traditional values go, development is not as such as can put it in. So I think this would be big questions for policymakers. because you can't change easily the tradition. You can't force people to go in institutions, even if you have the money. So these are big questions to be solved.
Thank you, Arjan. So I believe we have a raised hand online from Manolis. Manolis, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. I would like to thank you all and the panelists for their illuminating presentations. And I have a question, maybe primarily from Vladimir. Also, Branimir commented on that in his previous answer, but possibly the rest of panelists may want to comment. So, given the significance that was attributed by all, effectively, on negative net migration for the declining demographic trends in Western Balkans. The question is whether they see any possibility for a reversal of that coming. I guess that, through repatriation is not a possibility, given that people may return at a later age, and that wouldn't change demographic outlook of those countries, but possibly through immigration. And if there is scope for this to happen in the future, another question is whether they consider this as a trend that could be embraced and supported by governments and the society in those countries. And another question, very much shorter and factual. I know that you all focused primarily on Western Balkans, but I have a question on Bulgaria, which seems to me as an outlier even within the Balkans kind of region, with this huge decline over the past 30 years, like by 20% or something, which is comparable possibly only with Bosnia. So I'm wondering if there is any explanation why this has been the case for Bulgaria, such a steep decline, which doesn't seem to derive from emigration, as far as I can tell from the data that we have at hand. Thank you.
Should I start first? Okay, thank you. I don't know, from some wider historic perspective, this region has never been empty or deserted and so on. So from that perspective, if you look not more than 100 years in the past, a lot of things has been changed. The population changing, their ethnicity and whatever kind of structure you like. Even if you would ask now any policymakers, they are not maybe aware of that. They all think about that they are here and like some autochthon populations, but that was really not the case. So from that perspective, I'm not afraid that I don't know, the population will desert this whole area. But the question is where possible population would come from. We had that crisis several years ago, and reactions, or not only from the governments but from the common people, that they were not so they didn't like the idea of getting new neighbors so easily. But if you look at the policies and specifically the government and their policies, they're reluctant to this kind of thinking, because maybe they would officially say, yes, we think about that, but working a lot with them in I don't know, in recent 10 to 15 years, I'm afraid that they are not so aware of the possibilities that immigration could bring to the region. And as we see by these facts, we need immigration impulse at the moment, not in 10 or 15 years ahead, but right now. And it's a good question. But of course, you have that other consequences of that issue, because if you look about those cultural background of that, a lot of questions would be raised from that possible story of new immigrants. We know that very well. So it's not only the matter of economy and what we will do, but sooner or later, I think that the economic side will win. So, and I don't know what was the third for Bulgaria. I don't know it's about very low fertility for a very long period, but also emigration is very strong. It's quite known, and they even started to go to Germany, which was a quite new destination for them, unlike previous periods. And in that way, they are becoming very similar to other Western Balkan populations. So the drivers are pretty much the same as those that force people from these countries to emigrate. Okay, that was in short.
Maybe we can move back to the room, or Arjan and Branimir, would you like to add something?
A quick yes, the trends can be reversed. We have cases in history in the Western countries. I mean, Ireland is one of them, a classical, and it's, as Vladimir mentioned, it's about development, economic development. We have examples of that during the Greek financial crisis. We had in the 2011 census, 145,000 people migrated, Albanians migrated from Greece to Albania, and other solutions. Well, again, I'm using the case of Albania because I know it a bit more, is that for some of the manual jobs which you can't find people in the market as we speak in Albania, they've started to hire some of the big companies from South Asia, the employment. Will that be temporary? Will that be permanent? I don't think I have an answer to that. But I'll go with Vladimir that these countries, I mean, not just these countries, a lot of countries find a momentum and then development will start. And that predictions of UN about 100 years from now is just wrong. We can't predict more than 20 years. We just can't predict what technology will do. And no one could predict the effect of low fertility 30 years ago. No one would have predicted life expectancy of 85, 20 or 30 years ago. So we can't. In terms of Bulgaria, Vladimir's answer is spot on. Same factors. Even if fertility is low, 20% change in population cannot come from the natural increase, the difference between birth and death. It does come from migration. So Bulgaria is very much similar to this. I'll stop it.
Okay, Branimir?
Well, I can briefly maybe challenge, or let's say offer a different opinion to what the previous two speakers said. So, I mean, in theory, yes, it's possible to reverse the trend and to, let's say, stop immigration from the Balkans and make these countries, if you make the countries better places for living. But in reality, I'm not very optimistic that this will happen, at least not in a short period of time, because in order to see that, we need to see important changes, crucial, radical changes in the economic and social and political sphere, and we are not seeing that. We are not seeing that. I mean, I mentioned the redistribution of government, and the positive thing is that you can easily do that in the Balkan countries because taxes are low. So start taxing the rich and the big companies and start spending this money on those who need it, and you will start making big impact. But you can't do it because the political system is, let's say, captured by the elite. It's a typical example of elite capture, and that's why it's very difficult to do it. So in theory, yes, you can do that, but in practice, I'm not so optimistic. And I think Manoli's question was more specific about migration from other regions to the Balkans, and I'm not really sure that this is a viable or, let's say, reasonable option, because what we saw, for instance, during the previous big migration wave in 2015, when people from, let's say, Syria and other similar countries passed through, let's say, the Balkans, is that nobody of them wanted to stay in the Balkans. So there was, let's say, big, maybe not all, just say exclusively negative attitude of the local population towards migrants or refugees. But so people were saying we don't want them to stay. But on the other hand, people who are passing, the migrants, didn't even want to stay in the Balkans. So I don't think that this is a real, let's say, something which is likely to happen in the near time. Why? Because very nearby they have much more developed countries which offer much more opportunities, not just in economic sense, but in any sense, like social sense, and which integrate people better. I don't think about Austria or some other countries. And thinking from that perspective, I don't think that the Balkans are, let's say, a good option for people from other regions for locating here. So I don't think that's likely to happen anytime soon.
Can I add a sentence there? Because I don't think we disagree on that. Nothing will happen soon. I think both myself and Vladimir were talking, relatively, when demographers talk, we talk of a generation of 27 years. And I don't think anything can happen really soon. But I mean, I do think against you about that, the fact that the other population will not be accepted because of the attitude of local population. Do not assume that the French and the German and the British 35, 40 years ago were happy and less racist than the Balkans when it came to the Spanish or the Italians or the Portuguese coming from south of Europe. Societies develop, people are emancipated, and we're talking about another generation. I mean,
yes.
I happen to be at the age that I am, and I remember that, I mean, the relationship, let's say, between Macedonians and the Albanians were not the same as they are now, or the Serbs and the Albanians. So these things change even within a generation.
Yes.
Okay.
I agree. Can I just quickly, very briefly? So I didn't mean that, let's say, the people in the Balkans are racist and they hate people from other countries. That's not what I meant to say. What I wanted to say is that migrants, let's say, from I don't know, Syria or these other countries, they don't think about the Balkans as a good option for them because they have better alternatives very nearby, like, I don't know, Austria, Germany, and other countries. So in that sense, I didn't want to say that people in the Balkans are, let's say, they hate everybody else. That's not what I want to say.
I will have a few questions in the room, so we'll go back later for a final round. Diana, I will start a final round from you later, but for now, yes, please.
I just wanted the main questions which we try to avoid. You mentioned that doesn't matter how rich this country, number of the children per family, it's become less and less, particularly in the Balkans. And I'm asking you because you spend a lot of time thinking about how are you going to increase the number of the children? Do you have any idea? Social, it doesn't work. Doesn't matter how many money you give it, the people doesn't want the children. And what's the reason? What's the reason? How are you going to increase the number of children per family, particularly in the Balkans?
Okay, thank you. How do we raise fertility is the first question. And Otto?
Yes, this is Otto Anastasakis. And it was great, Kristijan. Well done for putting this panel together. My question as a political scientist, first and foremost, is what are the political implications of all this? The fact that the societies are aging and at the same time young people, and there's a lot of brain drain as well. So we had a very good discussion last year with Ivan Krastev, who was actually connecting the issue of out-migration with populism and the liberalism in all these countries. So I'm asking any one of you actually, how do you see the impact on politics? What kind of governments do we have in these societies as a result of this exodus of people and the aging of population?
Thank you, Lodan. That will have to be the last question. And now I can only give 1 minute per speaker for some very final remarks, maybe 2, but no more than 2. Diana, let's start from you.
Maybe we can respond to the question, which was about children.
Go for it.
No, so I'm looking at mortality, so I'll leave the fertility question to Arjan. The political implication of aging society, I mean, I look very much in the health aspect, but we can see, so for example, the crisis that happened now, the COVID-19 crisis, and having an unhealthy population, which results in a very high mortality, we see an impact into dissatisfaction in the population, and suddenly the population is not happy with the results they're seeing in terms of health outcomes, but those are not things that could be done right now to be changed. This is dissatisfaction that builds throughout the years. So any type of this type of health crisis that might occur will result in dissatisfaction of population, especially given the aging population, the high impact on medicine and the cost of medicine. We'll see less and less support from them for I think for governments that will not support them in that kind of sense.
I think that was very brief.
Very brief.
Vladimir?
The first one or the second one question?
Whatever you prefer. just be brief.
Okay, the first one, I would like to see the solution, but I wouldn't call it like that about low fertility. But it's the question that bothers much stronger countries than the countries of this region. It's a question for Germany, for Italy, for Spain, and for other countries. There are a lot of solutions, but in reality, not much of that works. So I don't know if I would stop there for this kind of discussion, but we can talk about that how much you would like another time. But at this moment, for example, the government in Serbia and other countries, they think that if they give direct cash benefits to the parents, that they will solve the problem. But you have a gray market, black market, and all other drivers that are pushing the fertility rates down, that they are really do not address that kind of drivers, and that's the big problem. If they would only start to deal with that kind of drivers that researchers force them to do or advise them to do, maybe some improvements would be visible, but I'm really doubtful about that.
Thank you. Arjan?
Well, I can't answer the second question, the political one, but I can say a few things about the fertility. How do we raise the children, the number of children in the Western Balkans? And I think Vladimir started it with that. Well, do not be optimistic. Once you have few children, that's what you have. You won't get many. The same has happened with China, the same has happened with a lot of other countries. And there are lots of theories that explain that, from economics to social, etc., etc. So even if we increase, we'd increase it to the best level of where Sweden has it at 1.8, 1.9, or France and UK at 1.7, which Montenegro is already there. So that is, in terms of the policies, existing policies in the Balkans, they're completely wrong, as Vladimir said. I mean, giving money to parents is absolutely, totally the wrong policy, because what it's doing is that it is increasing the fertility among the poor population, which means that it's increasing poverty, because the relationship between fertility and poverty is a strong one. What policies? I mean, South Europe gives us some clues, North of Europe gives us some clues. The Southern Europe policies is, they know that this level of very low fertility is related with the instability in the labor market, in particular for the young children. There's been quite a lot of research on that, among other things. So stability in the labor market and policies focused at the young people in terms of jobs and opportunities would be one. North of Europe, particularly the Scandinavian countries, focus on gender-related policies, because at the end of the day, the females are the ones that take time off and all these things, and policies such as, return and guaranteed the employment back at work or the career and so on and so forth. But as Vladimir said, this is a Nobel Prize question. If I knew the answer fully, in the next few years, I might be put up for a Nobel Prize, but I don't think I have.
Thank you, Arjan. Branimir?
Yes, briefly on the second question, we are doing some research on that. And so the idea is that, like I said, this aging and demographic decline is calling for a greater role of the government in the society and economy, which is basically more left-wing policies or more redistribution, more socio-demographic policies. So basically, it's calling for left-wing policies or progressive policies. But if the current economic or political system is such that it's captured by the elite, then we won't see such policies. And because of that, we will see disappointment. And like we saw, let's say in the US with Trump or in the UK with Brexit, and we will see protest votes and things like that, which will basically favor the right wing or the extreme right or the right wing policies, populists. And so that's one thing. So in general, I would say that these policies are going in favor of more right-wing policies. The trends are pushing in that favor, in that direction. And another factor which is contributing to this is that many people are leaving the countries, and usually the people who are leaving the countries are the progressives, and those people who stay are usually the conservative people, because the definition between conservatives and progressives is that conservatives stay, and progressive moves, and because of that, we are likely to see more conservative or again maybe right-wing policies. So I'm pretty pessimistic about the political implications of these demographic trends. Of course, things can change, but in principle, I'm not very optimistic.
Thank you, Branimir. And if there is a silver lining to young progressive voters leading the country, maybe we can hope for the diaspora vote to finally become more progressive. This has traditionally been very conservative. Okay, well, with that, I would have to end tonight's panel, even though it looks like we're all having a great time. We're already 4 minutes over time. And it's a very difficult topic to discuss in the sense that most of our conclusions, I believe, have been fairly grim, because that is the nature of the topic. But then that's what makes it even more salient, probably, and urgent for policymakers to wake up and realize these challenges and perhaps do something about them. Now, of course, we have all here and online as well aged by 1 hour and 50 minutes during this panel. But I hope it's been time well spent for all of us. And yes, maybe I can just end by echoing one of Arjan's points about how societies change over time. And of course, we can expect our societies in the region to hopefully become more progressive and open to accepting citizens from other populations and countries, and therefore mitigate some of these negative challenges that we're anticipating. Thank you once again for all of our speakers, the 3 of you online and Dijana in the room, especially for coming here in person. We really appreciated it. And we hope to see you next Wednesday, as I said in the beginning, for our next panel on a very different topic here at CSOX. And yes, thank you again for your attention, and have a good rest of your evening.
And thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Bye.